Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Cougar, the Bitch, and the Wardrobe. I'm your host, Lana Mazer, also known as Curated by the Cougar. Today, we're going to be discussing an important topic, which is navigating life with a legacy, growing up with mental illness in the family. This can be a very sensitive topic for many people, but I do feel that it's important for me to address this as I've alluded to different things that I had to deal with over my lifetime, specifically with my mother. And I really and truly believe that that relationship with my mother and having to manage and live with someone that suffered from mental illness truly shaped me into the person that I am today. So, I want to go back and give a little bit of family history. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. She had been born and raised in Romania, and during the Holocaust had been put in a ghetto with her family. And obviously, this were terrible, terrible times, so much suffering, so much pain, so much death. And she was a product of that. She had my mother very, very young. My grandmother was 16 years old when she married my maternal grandfather, who was in his 40s. And at the time, this was not only acceptable, but it was encouraged because he was able to get my grandmother out of Romania because he had a Spanish passport. And they went to Paris. And so my mother was born at the end of World War II in November of 1947, and she was raised in Paris. And in many, many ways, she and my grandmother were more like siblings than it was a mother daughter relationship, being that there was only 16 or 17 years between my mother and my grandmother. And so that again led to significant issues and challenges for the two of them. And my grandmother divorced my mother's father when my mother was 7 years old and eventually remarried another man who was the only grandfather that I ever knew. And without, again, digging into all the details of my grandmother and my mother's life, there were so many challenges and so many issues that it's difficult to say, the chicken before the egg. But my grandmother did suffer from bipolar disorder, which I really was only made aware of that when I was, I think, well into my teens, if not older. And I think it had been brought to my attention just because my mother spoke to me a little bit about it. And my mother also has two half sisters that had given me more information about it. And when I was growing up, especially as a child, very young, I didn't really understand what was going on with my mother. I was aware that she seemed different from the other mothers in the way that she communicated with me and treated me. But again, as a child, it's really, really hard to understand where that's coming from and what it means. So, for as long as I can remember, I had been in therapy. My mother put me in therapy when I was young. I mean, elementary school age. I want to say, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old. And that continued on throughout my life, on and off throughout my life. I have been in therapy for different reasons. Today, I'm in therapy because I do believe that it helps me to be the best version of myself. the best version of myself for me, for my children, and how I can show up in that way every day. And so that helps me. But throughout my life, it was for a multitude of other reasons, but mostly stemming from the challenges that I had with my mother. And again, during that time, especially as I got older and high school and young adulthood, I became more and more aware of these issues with my mother. But my mother was never very transparent about her own mental health. She was very open about the fact that she suffered from depression and anxiety, but not to the extent that I later found out what her diagnosis was. And I think for her that there was either some sort of, I don't even know if it was shame, but not really wanting to come face to face with the severity of her diagnosis and what it would take to work on it for her own benefit, and which would have clearly benefited her relationship with my father and her relationship with her daughters and her relationship ongoing with her family and friends. And so for many years, I suffered tremendously, and my sister did as well. My mother was, in many ways, amazing. People who met my mother just thought she was the life of the party. And on the outside, she was. She was very eccentric. She was very, very intelligent, and she was riotously funny. She would tell the best dirty jokes. And she was a writer and a voracious reader. And she was French. And so she had this, air of sophistication that comes with being French. And she was really an interesting person. But the truth of who she was really only shown to me and to my sister on a daily basis, and also to my father. And when I was in college, my parents got divorced. It was a horrible, long, drawn out divorce. It took them 4 years to finally get divorced. And when it was over, in many ways, I was relieved because it should have ended many years prior to that. It had become extremely verbally abusive between the two of them. And quite honestly, it's unfortunate because now when I look back on their marriage, I only have very strong memories of them fighting instead of those memories of when it was good between them. And I think that, again, this is a separate conversation, but we've talked about it before. It's like when people say that they should stay together for the kids know what's going on. And I knew what was going on for years. And so I think it was far worse that my parents stayed together more years than necessary, because instead of it ending and me being able to, and my sister being able to look back on the past and smile about the good memories, we just have a lot of bad ones that are more in the forefront of our minds. And fast forward, a lot of the negative interactions that I had with my mother continued on even once I moved out of the house. I was in college. Even when I got married to my first husband, she was very, very manipulative and really emotionally and verbally abusive. And I suffered tremendously from that, as did my sister. And the other part about it too is that my mother was incapable of having a relationship with both myself and my sister at the same time. And again, that was part of her diagnoses, which I later found out about, but she would triangulate, or it's called triangulation. And so if she were getting along with me, she would fight with my sister or tell me negative things about my sister, and vice versa. So for the first 30 years of my life, my sister and I did not have a great relationship. we were constantly vying for my mother's attention, and also under the assumption that the other one was doing all this bad stuff to upset my mother and create all these negative consequences. And the years went on like this. And then when I was 28 years old, newly married, newlywed, and this was actually a couple weeks before my wedding to my first husband, my mother told me that she had cancer and she was diagnosed with endometrial cancer. And unfortunately, because of the way that she took care of herself and not listening to certain protocols, the cancer spread. And a year and a half later, my mother died. And it was obviously a horrible time in my life. Even with all the stuff that I had experienced with my mother, I still lost my mother and mourned that loss, mourned her. And it was very traumatic for me. And I think that part of me was sad that perhaps she and I had never had any closure. Because even towards the very end of her life, and I had stayed behind in New York while my husband was in Los Angeles completing a fellowship. I stayed in New York to take care of her until she died. And even with all of that, it was awful with the way she treated me, the way she treated my sister until the moment of her passing. And when she died, I called her psychiatrist to let him know that she had passed. And he said to me, Lana, when you're ready, call me and come in to talk to me. It took me a year before I was able to gather the strength to call him, but I was very curious to see what he wanted to say to me, what he was willing to share, because in so many ways, he was like the man behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz or the Wizard of I don't even know what, because I had felt that my mother was suffering tremendously from mental illness and that this person had been doing nothing to help my mother's situation for years. And just to backtrack briefly, when I was in college, my sophomore year of college, I took abnormal psychology. And that was the first time I ever heard or learned about borderline personality disorder. And when I read about it, I remember thinking to myself, "Oh my god, this is who my mother is. This is what she has and how has this never been discussed?" She had never admitted to me that she had bipolar disorder. I assumed that she had just because of her highs and lows. And like I said, she was very upfront about the fact that she suffered from depression and anxiety. But those things were so commonplace at that point that it was almost like, oh, yeah, I'm a member of the club. Prozac had just come out. It was like the hottest drug. And so it was almost like if you weren't on Prozac, you weren't cool. And so for her, it was like she was part of this group of people. And so when I was ready to go and speak to my mother's psychiatrist, I was chomping at the bit to be like, my mother was bipolar. My mother had borderline personality disorder. How have you never done anything to help her? And that's exactly what I said when I went to see him. And he was in shock and he said, Lana, I thought I was going to have to spend the next hour telling you what your mother's diagnoses were and explaining them to you, but you literally hit the nail on the head. And as it turned out, my mother was aware of these diagnoses. She made it very clear to her psychiatrist that she only wanted to be maintained on meds. So the meds helped with her highs and lows um, with bipolar disorder. But with borderline personality disorder, you have to commit yourself to intensive psychotherapy in order to see any kind of improvement or any kind of change. And she didn't want to do it. And as a result, my sister and I suffered the brunt of that for many, many years. And I think it's really important to share insights on family history and mental illness and emphasizing the importance of understanding the legacy of that because with certain mental illnesses, there is a genetic component. And being aware of your family history is important for your own mental health. And if you have children, potentially their mental health as well. It's like anything else. We know that there are certain cancers that have a genetic component and how important it is to test for that and being aware of certain genetics that you may have in your family, whether it be with breast cancer and or ovarian cancer, etc. So similarly, it is with mental health. And I think a lot of times people don't want to talk about it because there is this element of feeling embarrassed and they don't want to be judged based on those facts. But I think that there is more and more awareness surrounding mental illness and mental health today than there ever was. So again, I really want to encourage my listeners today to be aware of those things in your family. So for me, the impact of my mother's diagnosis on myself and my sister, I think for me, when I learned of these diagnoses from her psychiatrist, and again, this was a year after my mother passed away, and my mother is now gone almost 19 years. But when I learned of these diagnoses and it had been confirmed for me, in a way, it served as closure. And what I mean by that is I had wanted closure with my own mother, and that was never gonna happen regardless of that her life was cut short by cancer, but I don't think I would have gotten closure from her in any way, even if she had lived 10 or 20 more years. And when I learned of her diagnoses, it made me realize who she was and how she suffered, and that in so many ways, because she didn't accept and invite proper treatment, that this was how she was. And it wasn't the mental illness was not a choice, obviously. And once I was able to wrap my head around that, a lot of the anger that I had felt towards my mother and the way that she had treated me throughout my life started to dissipate. And now that I'm 19 years past her death, with more therapy and understanding of who she was, I'm able to embrace her and her memory in a very, very different way. And one of the most beautiful things that I gained from the unfortunate loss of my mother was the relationship that I have with my sister. My sister is 2.5 years younger than me, and she also has two boys the same age as mine. And she is my best friend. And like I mentioned earlier in this episode, it was not like that for many, many years. It took my mother dying for us to find each other and to realize that what had been standing in the way of us having a loving relationship was my mother. And she was no longer there to prevent us from coming together. So, with the loss of my mother, there was a beautiful gain and gift of my sister, who is the closest person to me. Also, in retrospect, and it took me some time to wrap my head around this, and sometimes when I even hear myself verbalize it, I think, oh my God, I must sound like a monster. But the day that my mother died, my life began. And what I mean by that is that version of what my life had been like, where I felt so stressed and anxious and sad and being put on this emotional roller coaster every day of my life for the last 30 years, that went away. And so I was finally able to be the person that I wanted to be and embark on that life. And so to this day, when I say that out loud, I think, oh my God, I must sound like such a horrible person to say that, because I know for so many people dealing with the loss of a parent, whether it was years ago or recent, it's horribly painful. And that sadness for so many never is lifted. But I was able to finally understand that her passing was also a chance for a new beginning for me. And so that was something that, again, was hard to come to terms with and to verbalize. But I do think it's important for me to say that in the context of this podcast, because, again, it really helped shape me and put me on the path of who I am today. And going back also in talking about the genetic component of mental illness, I'm very pleased and happy to say that even with that genetic component with my grandmother and my mother, it is not something that affects my sister nor I. And we have not seen that in our children either. And we continue to be vigilant about watching behaviors in ourselves and behaviors in our children to make sure that we're on top of that, and that, again, there's no shame in therapy for an adult or for a child. And I've had my children in therapy for different reasons. More recently, when my ex and I announced to the kids that we were getting divorced, I wanted to make sure that they had the support from someone who wasn't a parent or a close family member. I do believe that coming from that background and dealing with that for so many years made me not just a strong person, and I also see myself as a survivor, because it was surviving mental and emotional abuse. I also see myself as it made me more empathetic and more sensitive to what people go through in their lives, because we don't ever truly know what goes on behind closed doors. As I mentioned earlier, people who knew my mother in a superficial way thought that she was this happy go lucky kind of person. And that was far, far from who she truly was. And no one would have ever known that. And she was deeply tormented and at times had contemplated suicide. So I do want to emphasize having an open dialogue about mental health and breaking the stigma associated with it. Mental health impacts our physical health and overall well being. I want to offer words of encouragement and remind my listeners today that you are not alone in your struggles. I invite you to share your stories with me. Please reach out to me either on Instagram at curated by the cougar. You can also now find me on YouTube at curated by the cougar. And you can also comment on Spotify at the cougar, the bitch, and the wardrobe. But reach out to close friends and family for support and seek out medical help if it's necessary, because finding that professional can help you significantly and can really help guide you, whether it be by speaking to a professional, but also, if necessary, to be put on the proper medications to help stabilize what you are going through. And those medications are there for a reason. It is not a death sentence. These meds can be a temporary help until you are back to where you need to be. So I want to thank you so much for tuning in today. And until next time.